spent some time dealing in the gray arms market. No, I didn't. I wasn't dealing in it. We
Yeah.
were addressing the problems in the gray arms market, and it's robust, as you know. And so the idea that you could get gear moved around the world to various hotspots, and the idea that there may be liaison officers in between some of these groups. Look, whether it's Al-Qaeda and the Sinaloa cartel, or whether it's ISIS and Islamic Jihad or whomever, there are contacts. It's they don't all completely operate in a bubble. So yeah, I think it is a possibility. I think a lot of what they do is homegrown. That comes from the training and the technical support that they get from Iran. Iran's the biggest problem, and as far as I'm concerned, the current administration, not to get overly political, but they seem to be at pains to say that Iran is responsible for Hamas. In part because they've been so keen to get back into a deal with Iran. I think they're afraid of the optic of spending 3 years or so being soft on Iran in a sense, and now Iran being responsible for this atrocity and this war that's building.
Yeah, it's having spent a good amount of my life bouncing back and forth, between Afghanistan and Iraq. I don't think people realize actually how, from a geographic perspective, how closely located a lot of these countries are. The neighboring, Iran, where it sits, Pakistan on the eastern side of Afghanistan, and continuing west, and you're going to eventually arrive, in Israel and in the Gaza Strip as well. And I also don't think people realize the undescribable amount of equipment and infrastructure that we left behind in Afghanistan. Yeah. Whether it be arming our partner force at the time or our allies at the time, however you would want to phrase it. I personally witnessed that, from them going from basically being unarmed to moderately well equipped. I wouldn't say necessarily a first world army, but probably knocking at the door at that. And then can you, from your, I have a literal boots on the ground understanding of both of those countries, not an operational or strategic level understanding by any stretch. I don't claim that. But could you paint a picture of what was left when we actually pulled out of Afghanistan? I'm curious as to your thoughts on how we actually, the execution of said withdrawal.
Yeah. As by way of a couple of examples, we got into Iraq in just at the very outset in 2003 of our, moving in there, and in part because at the time we were doing some work on behalf of some what would become infrastructure companies, right? That were out in Iraq for years, and we had been doing some work on their behalf elsewhere. And so anyway, we ended up there at the very outset, and it was striking even before things turned to shit, back in September or so of '03, when you could start to see it getting sideways. You could stroll into any open air market and buy an amazing array of hardware, right? And this was early days in Iraq, and it was surprising, at that point, because you felt like, okay, well, it's the Wild West in a sense, but it got worse down the road. It wasn't quite as open, but it was like going into Walmart and being able to buy just about anything that you wanted on the military hardware side. So, first of all, I guess the point of that story is that in that part of the world, gear is just available. It just floats around. It's like trading in a commodity, right? And nobody finds it surprising because there's so much conflict. There's so much tribal, conflict that goes on as on one level. Not to even talk about the terrorist side of things, but it's there and it's available. So you transfer that over to Afghanistan, and Afghanistan is actually even worse, right? Because they've been battling each other and others forever. And so, but I think the notion in a sense of Afghanistan and how we pulled out, there was a desperation, right, to to end this, right? And people were fatigued. People were fatigued, 10 years before that. But just people didn't want to think about it. They didn't want to pay attention to it. They were done. And the Biden administration, I think, read that as, politically, this is the way to go. This is what we should do. This is beneficial in a sense for us to just, shut the screen door and walk away. And there was no legitimate analysis or thought given to what that meant, right? There was no, it was almost as if they believed this notion that we had to appease the Taliban by sticking to some arbitrary or imaginary timeline. It was the most absurd, ineffective, disgusting, process. There was no, again, I don't know where the leadership went. The idea that there was going to be something stable left behind. We knew that from the Soviet days, right? We knew that the Soviets spent the last 5 years of their occupation trying to get the hell out because they couldn't control it. They made their problems were the same problems we had, and we knew that. And yet we thought somehow we were going to do it better. And so this notion that, we had intelligence and we had assessments talking about, how stable the Afghan army was and how long it might, support a pseudo democratic government. It's absurd. There was just no way. They never bought what we were selling. The Afghan people, they didn't even know what we were selling, So I don't know. It's depressing on one level because I saw again, old enough to have seen the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And yeah, history repeats itself. You just like to think it doesn't do it quite that quickly.
Yeah, one of the most disturbing things for me is people, it would be easy, and I do put responsibility on Biden because he was the person in the seat at the time continuing with that decision. But to think that what happened with our country and first off going there in the first place and then our eventual departure that only rides with Biden. So you're kind of forgetting what happened with Bush and then what happened with Obama and then what happened with Trump. And people oftentimes focus on only the elected official portion of that. I have read now quite a few reports of senior military officers giving their true thoughts when they thought they weren't being recorded or when they thought that their true thoughts weren't being written down. And then the bullshit that they would go spew elsewhere, whether it be in public facing or going before Congress. And nobody is holding those senior military leaders accountable. I can tell you as somebody, I peaked out. My rocket hit an apex at 03. I was a lieutenant at my absolute apex of my military career. And I could have given you a more accurate assessment of the capabilities and abilities of the ANP, Afghan National Police, the ANA, Afghan National Army, and all of the little splinter organizations that we created, propped up, and worked by, with, and through. And for people only listening, I'm using air quotes on that because to truly accomplish the mission that we were doing, on paper, yes, we were doing by, with, and through. Let's just say the tactical execution on target. Maybe they were corralled in a different area. Maybe they were just kind of looking over here in this direction. But not a single senior military officer stood up and did the right thing and told the fucking truth and turned in their caller device. And they all knew. If you spent time over there, you understood the realities, and the realities is not what was sold to the American people. It is so fucked. And I wish that more scrutiny was brought on those senior military officers because it's a combination of those things, right? They're the execution wing of our foreign policy. There's the elected leaders and those at the highest level of the military. And on the other hand, I get it because they leave being a 4-star general and now they work at Boston Dynamics or they work at Harris,
right.
Or not speaking pejoratively about those two companies. Those are just the first two that come to mind. Yeah.
Right.
It's
no, I mean, I think there was and you see, again, just kind of looking at how things just always kind of come back around, whether it was Vietnam or really, any conflict, you get that all the time. You get the, what do they say in private? And, what are they then, when they get up to the podium, what are they telling the American public? there was no, I remember a conversation. It was, I think it was 2000, maybe it was 2003 or four. So it was a long time ago, right? But I remember talking about Afghanistan with a fellow who was a smart guy, right? He was teaching at a university, had a military background, and older fellow, and I was very skeptical, right? In part because of that experience with the Soviets exiting Afghanistan and what took place afterwards, and then watching all of that, and then seeing what the papers were, saying from the Kremlin. And, we got all that paperwork, right? I mean, we know what the Soviet Union was struggling with, right? And so his point was, no, it'll be different this time. And when you try to drill down and say, well, why is it going to be different? It would be like, well, because we're America, and we have their best interests at heart, and we're bringing democracy, and we're doing all these things. And there was no way to shift them off this position. Like, we were going to stand on the sidelines and throw, chocolate bars and nylons to the adoring crowds as we drove through the villages, and it was all going to be good.